are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12s. This is Corbin Smith, your host for Locked On Seahawks. Joining me as always, my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. It's officially roster cutdown day around the NFL. We've seen some fireworks, some unexpected ones from other teams. Not too many cuts revealed yet for the Seahawks. Have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with this particular day on the NFL calendar because on one hand, you've got the regular season getting close, so you're excited about the 53-man roster being revealed. At the same time, a lot of players are going to receive pink slips over the next 24 hours, and you never like to see that. That's the bad part about the business, but it's the way things have to go when teams are trimming their rosters to 53 players. So we'll be examining the cuts that have been revealed so far for the Seahawks, and of course, breaking down a big trade, Seattle bringing in a former Washington Husky star to try to upgrade their secondary. Jam-packed episode coming your way, so let's get rolling. The NFL season is about to begin, and nobody covers it like the Locked On Podcast Network. August 30th through September 8th, Locked On's Ultimate Season Preview will take you through every team at every division with the help of Odyssey's Ross Tucker and Jason Lockenfora. Follow the Ultimate Season Preview 2021 feed on the Odyssey app or wherever you get podcasts to tune in beginning August 30th. Now for your lead story here on Locked On Seahawks. Roster cuts are officially underway across the league. Only a handful of them have been revealed so far for the Seahawks, but they will have to have their roster trimmed from 80 players to 53 by 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time today. So I expect we're going to see those cuts really start to trickle in as they work down from 80 to 53 players. No real surprises up to this point. Nothing like the Patriots releasing Cam Newton, though I personally was not that surprised by that move. A lot of people out there are. Nothing like that so far for the Seahawks. Looking at the players that have been reportedly waived to this point, a pair of tight ends, Ian Bunting and Cam Sutton, receiver Darius Roberson, tackle Tommy Champion, guard Jarrett Hocker, and defensive tackle Jared Hewitt. So a number of undrafted rookies being cut as part of this first wave of roster cuts going from 80 to 53. Really no real surprises. No players that I believe you and I thought had an opportunity to make this football team.
Yeah, as you said, Corbin, no real surprises from what has been reported as Seahawks cuts to this point. And as you said, it's going to be 1 p.m. Pacific time is when the Seahawks have to announce their cuts to the league. But let's do a real quick history lesson. We know the way that John Schneider and the Seahawks operate. I think that it's highly unlikely that there is going to be some list floating around on the internet at 1 p.m. that we all will know who the players that Seattle has released. Because, of course, again, we know how the Seahawks have operated on cut down day in the past, Corbin, because there are literally hundreds of players that are now available to them. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Seattle's final 53-man roster, the one that they actually take to Indianapolis to face the Colts here in a couple of weeks, I would not be surprised at all if there's a couple of players who spent their training camp elsewhere. And so I think that this is a really important day when it comes to building your roster. But I also think it's going to be one of those days. There's going to be a lot of Seahawks fans, a lot of just NFL fans in general, who are going to be constantly refreshing on social media until they actually get the final 53-man roster.
Yeah, you're going to be on your computers or you're on your cell phone, and you're going to be scrolling down, waiting for the refresh mode so you can see which players get cut. And I'm not surprised that we've only seen a handful of names to this point. Some fans have been freaking out about it. It's like this is how this goes almost every year for the Seattle Seahawks. Last year was a little bit different just because we didn't have a preseason. I think that played a role in it. You know, John Schneider didn't have to worry about, there's film out there on some of these players. This year, with the preseason returning, that's a little bit different. But I think what's worth noting with these players, again, as I mentioned, you and I didn't think that any of the players that have been released as waivers so far were going to have a chance to make the 53-man roster. But I do think that there are some players here that have a real good chance to be on the 16-man practice squad when it's all said and done. In particular, for me, I think defensive tackle Jared Hewitt, who played at Virginia Tech, I saw issues with him as a run defender on his college film. That played into his preseason games as well. But you can see the flashes of brilliance as an interior pass rusher. And he had 9.5 sacks his last 2 years with the Hokies. So I feel like he is a player that's well worth developing this year, especially with the limited depth that they have at the defensive tackle position. I didn't think he was ready to be on a 53-man roster, but Hewitt is a player on that list that I think would be a great addition to the practice squad. And depending what happens with Tyler Mabry, I'm expecting that he is going to be one of the players that's cut, but they're going to try to get him back to practice squad. If they're able to do that, this might not happen. But if they can't bring him back, Sutton might be a player. He's shown enough during their preseason games and their mock scrimmage that he might be a player that's worth developing on the practice squad as well. Jared Hocker being a big-bodied guard, never going to have too much depth in that regard. Darius Roberson did some nice things on special teams at a touchdown the last game. So there are a number of guys here that could make a lot of sense to retain on that practice squad for the 2021 season. At least initially, we know they do a lot of shuffling on that practice squad as well.
No, they do. But I'm happy that you mentioned the practice squad. Pete Carroll has been kind of, just touting how excited that he is that the NFL this year has expanded the practice squad to 16 players and including veterans. So certainly every NFL team out there, Corbin, is going to have so much more flexibility, with that practice squad. So, yeah, I agree. Of those 6 players that we just listed, it had been reported as being released by Seattle so far. The tight ends, Ian Bunting, and Cam Sutton. Receiver Darius Roberson, the offensive lineman Tommy Champion, guard Jared Hocker, as well as defensive tackle Jared Hewitt. I agree. I think that Hewitt, to me, makes some sense as a practice squad addition. I also agree with tight end Cam Sutton specifically, but just that position in general. I was intrigued by what I saw from Tommy Champion. To me, he is another one of those young offensive linemen that makes a lot of sense to put on your practice squad and continue to develop him. And then Darius Roberson, as you mentioned, he caught the only touchdown that the Seahawks have thrown to a wide receiver throughout the preseason. So he has that memory, obviously. He also has some quality tape. He's kind of a sawed-off receiver. To me, he's very much like what the Seahawks already have in D. Eskridge, and presumably a player that made both of our rosters when we were kind of speculating who's going to be the final 53. A player like Penny Hart. He got a similar frame as that, but again, what that suggests is that if you have D. Eskridge, if you have a Penny Hart, if you have other players like, Aaron Fuller, for example, Cade Johnson, for example, that have these similar body types, Corbin, just what that speaks to is how important that role is in Shane Waldron's offense. So, yeah, another reason why Darius Roberson, I think, absolutely has a chance of being one of the Seattle's practice squad candidates.
And I would expect, as I mentioned a few moments ago, probably while we're recording right now, there are a few other players that are being announced that have been waived by the Seahawks. They have to get down from 80 to 53. Right now, they are only at 73. So they still got to cut 20 players before that 1 p.m. deadline. And most likely they have already told players that they have been released, but those are going to be slowly trickling in. We're not going to be seeing those long lists coming from the Seahawks. The 49ers haven't had any announced to this point. So you can make the argument John Lynch is even more guarded on his roster cuts than what the Seahawks are being. And then there are other teams, their entire list has already been reported. So every organization does things differently. But coming up on our Wednesday show, we will look at the entire picture, because by that point we should know which 53 players initially made the roster. And of course, we'll be looking at some of the other moves that are going to be coming in coming days, because we know John Schneider's initial 53 is not going to be the 53 when they travel to face the Colts. There's going to be plenty of roster shuffling in the next week and a half before they actually play in their first regular season game. When we come back in the second quarter, the Seahawks made a significant trade on Monday, bolstering their secondary. Second time in less than a week that they've traded for a cornerback, and this is a player that fans in the Pacific Northwest are pretty familiar with. So we're going to break down the addition of Sidney Jones to Seattle's secondary when we return. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's that time of year again, and all eyes are turning to football as teams are back on the gridiron to start a new season. As always, BetOnline is your number one spot for all the pro and college football action this season. Get all the updated odds, props, and contests, including online's biggest $500,000 NFL Mega Contest and the world's largest 200,000 NFL Survivor Contest, open now at BetOnline. Head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today to receive your 100% welcome bonus using the code Locked On. Be sure to take advantage of their opening day promo. Make a bet on the Thursday, September 9th season opener between the Buccaneers and the Cowboys. And if you lose, your wager will be refunded up to $25 for new customers only when signing up and using promo code NFL100. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet all your favorite sports, football, basketball, boxing, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait and take advantage of all the great offers available for the upcoming season. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Tuesday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. As always, joined by Rob Rang. The Seahawks making their second trade for a cornerback in less than a week on Monday, acquiring Sidney Jones from the Jacksonville Jaguars in exchange for a sixth-round pick in 2022. Last week on Wednesday, John Reed arrived via trade from the Houston Texans in exchange for a conditional seventh-round pick. We don't know if Reed is going to make the initial roster or not. A little different skill set, a little different body type for these two particular players when you're looking at Sidney Jones versus John Reed. So it's possible both players could be on Seattle's 53-man roster. But when we talk about Sidney Jones, this particular player is revered in the Pacific Northwest because he was a two-time first-team All-Pac-12 selection for the Washington Huskies, declared early after his junior season, looked like a surefire first-round pick, and unfortunately suffered an Achilles tear that caused him to miss most of his rookie season with the Philadelphia Eagles, and injuries have truly been a major problem for him throughout his 4 NFL seasons. It's really prevented him from reaching his potential to this point. But this seems like a pretty good gamble, just giving up a sixth-round pick when we're talking about a kid that is still only 25 years old, who has been pretty productive when he's been healthy.
Yeah, I mean, this is a young man who is entering his 5th season in the NFL, Corbin, and as you say, he's still just 25 years old. I mean, so it's kind of like Rasheem Green with the Seahawks, that you see the talent and you see still the untapped potential. And I would 100% agree with you that this feels like a low-risk kind of a gamble by the Seahawks. As you mentioned, trading away a 6th-round pick for a former 2nd-round pick in Sidney Jones. Of course, he was selected by the Philadelphia Eagles a couple of years ago, and then wound up, of course, moving on to the Jacksonville Jaguars, where he was able to kind of resurrect his career because he did struggle with injuries, throughout his first 4 seasons in the NFL. But I was really intrigued by what I saw from him a season ago in Jacksonville, as we talked about before with the Jacksonville Jaguars, a completely new, front office and head coach, and they are going to have different philosophies on that position. And so not at all surprised to see the Jacksonville Jaguars decide to move on. Just surprised to see Sidney Jones coming back to Seattle, because as you mentioned, he is very different physically than what Seattle has prioritized the cornerback position in the past. Even when Seattle has focused in on some of these so-called smaller cornerbacks, like a Trey Brown, like a DJ Reed, even if they didn't have the arm length, they were so physical, so tenacious. Sidney Jones is a quality tackler, but he has not played with the consistent physicality that some of the other corners that Seattle has drafted. But he's the smoothest athlete of any corner that Seattle has on their roster, in my opinion. I mean, this guy, his light feet, his fluid hips, legitimate 4.4 speed. I mean, this guy is a cover corner. And you think about some of the receivers that the Seahawks are going to be facing, especially in Arizona. With just straight line speed, the Rondale Moore types, the Tutu Atwell types, another rookie just drafted by the Rams. So Corbin, I love this move for the Seahawks. I think that it is a high upside type of a move for Sidney Jones here. I think that he really, truly can resurrect his career. And ultimately, the last thing I would say about kind of comparing Sidney Jones to some of the other corners already on Seattle's roster, the hugest difference to me is ball skills. Sidney Jones has the hands and the awareness of a wide receiver. He has the preparation of a Pro Bowl. I remember interviewing him, right before the draft a couple of years ago. I was so impressed with his acumen, just his intelligence at the position. So I really am excited about this move for the Seahawks. As you talked about before with his Achilles tear, I have some perspective there as well. I just really think this is the type of move that savvy general managers make all the time, and John Schneider certainly is that.
When you look at Sidney Jones' career, he has missed 28 regular season games due to injury. 15 of those were his rookie season. He was able to make it back the end of December and played in one game, made 2 tackles for the Eagles. And then he's had some hamstring issues. He had another mild Achilles issue that he was dealing with last season that cost him a handful of games in Jacksonville. So he has not been able to stay healthy consistently. And that was not an issue for him at Washington. He was healthy his entire time with the Huskies. And so it's just been a lot of bad luck since he got into the league and playing for the Eagles and the Jaguars. But with the limited snaps he's had, he has not even played 1,000 defensive snaps in his career. The Seahawks obviously can't know for certain what they have in this kid. You've seen some flashes on film. He intercepted Aaron Rodgers last year, for example. I mean, obviously that will excite Seahawks fans. He also gave up a 73-yard touchdown in coverage in that same game, though. So kind of a good news, bad news type proposition. We're talking about one of the Seahawks' biggest rivals in the NFC. Jones had an up and down game, and that's really been the way his career's played out. Those have been the couple issues that he's really had. He struggled at times with missing tackles, and he gave up 21 yards per reception last year in coverage. That was not as big of an issue for him his first 3 years, but a few of those really big plays skewed those numbers with limited targets against him last year. So those are 2 areas. If you can't tackle consistently and you're letting receivers get behind you, you're not going to play for Pete Carroll. He's going to have to clean those areas up to be able to see the field for this team. But at the same time, you mentioned the talent on Seattle's roster, the cornerback position compared to Jones. You can already make the argument he has been more productive than any player that's competing for that left starting cornerback job, including Ahkello Witherspoon. Witherspoon's played over 2,200 defensive snaps compared to just 900 something for Sidney Jones. And Sidney Jones has as many interceptions and has one more pass breakup than what Witherspoon does in more than, less than half of the snaps. Yeah. And so he's been far more productive, and that speaks to the ball skills that you talked about. You can see the fluidity, especially against in-breaking routes. That's been a huge issue for Trey Flowers throughout his career. You don't have that problem with Sidney Jones playing on the outside. He has shown he can tackle. It's just been inconsistent. So there's a lot of physical tools that you like there. You love the football acumen. If you can just keep him healthy, you put him back in a scheme that he should be very familiar with. Todd Wash was the defensive coordinator in Jacksonville up till last year before getting fired with the new coaching staff. And Todd Wash comes from Seattle's system. He was the defensive line coach under Pete Carroll for a couple of seasons. And then he was with Gus Bradley in Jacksonville before he became the defensive coordinator. So he ran a very similar system. All of these things are working in favor for Sidney Jones to be able to find his way onto the field fairly quickly for the Seahawks. The key is going to be staying healthy. And as I mentioned, you better not let receivers get behind you. That's the number one no-no for Pete Carroll's defense. If he's able to curb that and he's able to learn from one of the better coaching staffs at developing defensive backs in the league, then I really think that this is a chance for him to truly soar and fulfill his potential. This is still a very young kid that has a lot of upside, and he just hasn't been able to get there in large part because of his health.
That's it. That's exactly it. It's the durability. It's the same thing that we've talked about before about how, Seattle has some concerns about, say, the offensive lineman, Cedric Ogbuehi, who is, a player that we've debated over and over again and whether or not he might make Seattle's roster. I think the Jacksonville Jaguars just are just finished with the questions about durability the same way that the Eagles were. And that's just the way that the NFL goes sometimes. Again, we've talked about that. NFL stands for not for long. Players that have durability issues, and Sidney Jones at 5'10", 185 pounds, soaking wet. He is a slim-framed guy. He's got really light, slim arms and legs. He looks breakable. He is very different built than most of the Seahawks cornerbacks. But again, just the different level of athleticism and ball skills are what gets you so excited about him. The fact that the major injury, as you mentioned, 15 of the 28 games that he's missed came in his true rookie season. And he showed a great deal of work ethic in coming back to compete at the end of that season. So with the one major injury being a soft tissue, Achilles tendon, not a reconstruction of a knee, not a spinal issue, then you do have some confidence that he is going to be able to work his way through this. This is a guy who, again, is you don't have any questions about athleticism. You don't have any questions about work ethic or ball skills. To me, that's why this deal makes so much sense at this point in the season.
And we'll have more opportunities to talk about where Jones fits into Seattle's plans later in the week. We'll be having John Shipley of the Jaguar report for Sports Illustrated coming on to break down what he saw from Jones during his time in Jacksonville and why he believes he will be a really intriguing addition for the Seahawks. I can already tell you that based on my conversations with John, and I'm looking forward to digging deeper on an episode later this week as we look at this trade and what it could mean for the Seahawks defense moving forward. When we come back in the third quarter, every other team has to go from 80 players to 53. And as I mentioned, some teams have revealed more cuts than others to this point. But Rob and I are going to be looking at 4 or 5 players that have already hit the waiver wire that could be intriguing pickups for the Seahawks to add to their roster before their season opener against the Indianapolis Colts. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is brought your way by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. So why endure the often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com at your home and in your pocket. Why choose to spend 30%, 50%, or even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or a car dealership? Save time and money by going to rockauto.com. It's a family business that has served do-it-yourselfers for 20 years and offers reliably low prices for every customer. They have everything you could need: brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil. I even just ordered a steering wheel cover for my new Dodge Charger. Go to the easy-to-use rockauto.com right now and see the auto parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. Have you ever been in this situation? You've got one device that lets you catch the game live, another that lets you stream your favorite shows. You're watching sports highlights on your phone, and you've got your neighbor's best friend's login for the good stuff. Well, I want to tell you about a simple way to get all that entertainment you love without all the hassle, and a great way to finally get your TV together. It's called DirecTV Stream, and it brings your live TV and on-demand favorites together like never before, so you can watch your favorite sports, movies, and shows all in one place. That means no more juggling remotes and no need to buy another device ever again. And the best part, there's no annual contract. Thank goodness. So get rid of the clutter and the confusion and get your TV together with DirecTV Stream. You can learn more at directv.com. That's directv.com. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast. I'm your host, Corbin Smith, as always, joined by Rob Rang here for our Tuesday episode. We broke it down earlier. Only a handful of cuts have been announced for the Seahawks as they trim their roster from 80 players to 53, but all other 31 teams in the league have to do the same before today's 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time deadline. And of course, that means there's going to be some intriguing talent that is going to be leaving other rosters and hitting the waiver wire. And so, Rob, what we're going to do this the next couple of days, because you and I both know that this is kind of a merry-go-round, this process. You have your first wave of cuts, and then players get claimed off waivers. And in order to fit them on a roster, you got to cut players to make room for them on the 53-man roster. So then those players become available to claim. And it just goes over and over again for about a week or so. And so we're going to be discussing this over and over again, looking at players that might be able to help the Seahawks that come from other rosters. And I want to start with a player that our listeners should be pretty familiar with. And it was a cut that I was actually really surprised about today. The Buffalo Bills waiving veteran tight end Jacob Hollister, who played his past 2 seasons with the Seahawks and had almost 650 receiving yards, 6 touchdowns, 68 receptions in 2 seasons. He really gave the Seahawks a lift with the injuries they've had at tight end. And so it would seem like that would be a natural fit for Seattle to bring him back, especially with uncertainty about when Colby Parkinson's going to be able to return to the field and be able to play in a game early in the regular season. It sounds like they're optimistic about his status, but he's recovering from a broken foot. You know what Hollister can bring to the table. I didn't think they were going to re-sign him because of his fit in this offense. I still have some questions about that because of his play style. This is not an inline blocking tight end, But at the same time, that's not really Colby Parkinson's game. And if Parkinson's going to be out for a few weeks, Russell Wilson has plenty of trust in Jacob Hollister. I could see a reunion happening here in the next couple of days.
Yeah, I absolutely could. There's been two former Seattle tight ends, Corbin, who have been released so far. Jacob Hollister, Stephon Sullivan, former wide receiver and tight end from LSU, who went to Carolina. He also reportedly has been released. So, as you mentioned, there's been so much concern about the depth at tight end because of the questions about Colby Parkinson, if he's going to be able to return as quickly as the Seahawks hope with that. Recurring foot injury. I think it's a really good point here that you're making as far as Jacob Hollister and how his body style is different than, say, a Colby Parkinson, and maybe the way that the Seahawks might use a player like Hollister. To me, 6'3", 245 pounds roughly. He's basically the same size as Gerald Everett, and I just think that Everett is a better athlete. And so I think that the Seahawks upgraded there. But Hollister, of course, the Seahawks know very, very well. They do have, depth concerns at that position. So if they do get back the news that they don't want on Parkinson, it's going to be weeks, months, perhaps, rather than just a matter of days. If that is in fact the case, then I would expect tight end to be one of the biggest positions of concern for Seattle. And so certainly a player like Hollister or again Sullivan, who does have more similar height to Parkinson, although clearly Hollister is the better player at this point. But still, I do think that will be a position that Seattle will consider. Another position that we've talked about, quickly transitioning to other players that have been released, Corbin, is of course defensive tackle. And, one of the players that I was really excited about entering last season's NFL draft and college football season was the big defensive tackle from Florida State, Marvin Wilson. I thought that I saw flashes of this guy being a top 50 type of a player. And then, unfortunately, he didn't have the senior season that I certainly was expecting. Was drafted late by the Cleveland Browns and then wound up getting himself released. I think that there is enough talent here, and I'm a big Clint Hurt fan, that Marvin Wilson, the defensive tackle, a rookie from Florida State, again, released by Cleveland, at least reportedly, to me, he's one of those other players that would make some sense for Seattle, at least to kick the tire, so to speak.
I have been a big fan of Marvin Wilson dating back to his sophomore year at Florida State because like you, I thought this guy is going to be a second, maybe even a first-round draft pick. He's going to be an early draft choice. He's got good football skills, around 305 pounds. He's got the perfect build to play that three-tech position. He's a former five-star recruit. But after his junior year was solid. He had 5 sacks in just 9 games for the Seminoles. So that is when you really started to think it's coming together. We're starting to see the player that we thought we were going to see as a 5-star recruit. And then his senior year was really disappointing. So I actually don't think he was drafted. I'll have to double check on that, but I actually think he was undrafted and the Cleveland Browns signed him. There were some concerns. He did not have a good pro day workout. It was underwhelming in that regard. There were some questions about work ethic. So there's a lot of red flags that I'm listing here, but I agree with you. Clint Hurt has proven that he can coach up anybody at that defensive tackle position. He's one of the best assistants the Seahawks have. I think he's one of the better defensive line coaches in the NFL. And Marvin Wilson, there's never been a question about the talent. And so I think he would be a player that would be intriguing to take a flyer on. And I just want to throw this storyline at you real quick because I didn't think we'd ever be talking about Malik McDowell again on this podcast, given the fact that he had not played in the NFL for 4 years. He had that ATV accident, never played a snap for the Seahawks. And yet it looks like he's got a really good chance of making the Cleveland Browns roster. He had a great preseason for them. What a comeback it has been for him so far, trying to get back on an NFL roster. We'll see if he makes the 53. The Browns' full list of cuts has not been released yet, but the fact that Wilson got cut is a pretty good omen that Malik McDowell may make that roster. How ironic would it be if McDowell ends up clicking in Cleveland and Marvin Wilson comes to Seattle and ends up finding his groove and becomes a contributor in Seattle's defensive line rotation? There's just a lot of irony to that. And so I think it's a storyline that would be interesting to follow. I certainly think Marvin Williams would be an intriguing waiver claim for the Seahawks, a guy that I think certainly had the talent to be a day 1 or day 2 pick. Did not play close to that level his last year at Florida State. Just an inconsistent player. If you can get more consistency from him, you can coach him up. I still think there's a quality NFL defensive tackle there. I want to go to the offensive line now, and we're going to swing to the NFC. And this is a player that you and I were both pretty high on going into the draft a few years back, coming out of Oregon. Tyrell Crosby was a first-team All Pac-12 selection his senior year with the Ducks, won a bunch of awards as one of the top tackles in the entire college football ranks. The Lions drafted him. His NFL career has been somewhat underwhelming. He has started 18 games in his first 3 seasons. He has shown flashes of being a quality NFL tackle, but he's been very inconsistent. And really, penalties have been a big issue for him. He had 7 penalties in barely over 300 offensive snaps 2 years ago. So that has been a problem for him. Drawing flags. He's had some issues at times in pass protection, gave up 3 sacks a few years ago. But I never expected the Lions to give up on him this quickly. I suppose drafting Sewell out of Oregon, another Oregon standout, played a role in that. But I was surprised that they moved on from a 25-year-old like Crosby that was such a good college player, and he's had his moments in the NFL. I look at Seattle's tackle depth, and I could see Crosby making sense of player. Given his age and his pedigree, I still think there's an NFL starter in there. Maybe that is a guy that can compete to be your heir apparent for Dwayne Brown or even be a right tackle in 2022. I think he's worth a flyer.
No, I agree with you. I think that he's worth a flyer as well. I think in a lot of ways he's similar to what the Seahawks currently have with Cedric Ogbuehi, and it remains to be seen, of course, if Ogbuehi fits the roster, makes this roster. But with Tyrell Crosby, I see a guy who has true swing tackle ability. You mentioned the fact that 18 career starts. Those have been on both sides of the offensive line. He was a superstar for the Oregon Ducks. The left tackle position was the Morris Trophy Award winner a couple of years ago, which is an award, Corbin, that the competition is who votes. So the Pac-12 defensive lineman voted Tyrell Crosby the best blocker that year in the entire Pac-12. One of my absolute favorite awards because players know who can play. Anyways, but Crosby didn't allow a single sack his senior season for the Ducks. I went to Mobile, Alabama that year to watch him at the Senior Bowl, and I didn't think that he was quite as good there as he had been in the Pac-12. There were some foot issues that kind of popped up in medical reports, and that's one of the reasons why a guy who, again, did not give up a single sack wound up falling away in the 5th round. And durability issues, consistency issues have been some of the things that have plagued him in Detroit. But you mentioned, or we mentioned, Marvin Wilson, the defensive tackle in Cleveland, and I would argue that Cleveland's defensive line, and part of that is because of Malik McDowell, is one of the strongest defensive lines in all of the league. So it would make some sense for a savvy general manager to try to pick up some of the players that don't quite make a team as talented as the Cleveland Browns defensive line group. So to me, that's why Wilson makes some sense. I mention that because it's the exact opposite in Detroit. As you mentioned, the Lions drafted Penei Sewell, who was Crosby's replacement at Oregon at left tackle, and he is just a different level of talent. He's moved over to that right tackle position, the one that
Crosby, and they still have Decker too. So
and they do, exactly. They have Taylor Decker as well. So 2 former first-round picks, and they have brand new coaching staff, brand new front office there. I just think that they want their guys, the guys that they've drafted, the guys they're building around. So again, I think that Tyrell Crosby is a legitimate NFL player. I love the positional versatility that he has offered. I just don't know that he plays with the consistent physicality, the nastiness that Mike Solari has prioritized. To me, again, he's a very similar player as Cedric Ogbuehi. So some of the concerns that Seahawks have about his durability, his consistency, it's basically the same story with Crosby, but he's a younger player, and coming back to the Pacific Northwest, might light that fire that teams have been struggling with Crosby for a while now.
The last player I want to mention, staying on the offensive line, we know Seahawk fans, based on the messages we receive on social media, we know fans are concerned about the center position. And Matt Skura, who started a bunch of games for the Baltimore Ravens the last 4 years, he was cut by the Miami Dolphins reportedly. And this is a guy that has started 51 games over the last 4 seasons. And last year did not get really – he had pretty poor grades from Pro Football Focus. But I find it interesting when you look at the grades and then you also consider the fact that last year he played 661 snaps. He only gave up 1 sack and 10 pressures. So I think the Seahawks would take that at the center position. And the year before that, he had much better grades on Pro Football Focus, 717 snaps, 1 sack, and 7 pressures. So he in the past has been reliable, has not been a heavily penalized center. He's still only 28 years old. He did have a significant knee injury a couple years ago, but he's made it all the way back. You look at what the Seahawks have at the center position right now. Matt Skura comes in day one, is automatically an upgrade over the players that the Seahawks have in Kyle Fuller and Ethan Posick, maybe Brad Lundblade if they keep him on the practice squad. They need to do something at that position. Matt Skura is a guy that they could claim off waivers or wait till after waivers if he's unclaimed and sign him, that I think could come right in, being a seasoned veteran, still only just 28, and could start for you against Indianapolis in week 1. It would give you a much better pivot position player than what they currently have on the roster.
Yeah, I think Skura is a really interesting player, Corbin. As we just talked about before, and I was kind of arguing why I think that Crosby from Detroit and why they may have released him, or, again, Lewis in Cleveland, why they may have released him. The Miami Dolphins are an interesting team. Of course, they have the same coach and staff from the last from a year ago, but Matt Skura played his college ball at Duke, which is more kind of shotgun spread offense, and then got drafted by or wound up with the Baltimore Ravens. Played right guard his rookie season as a starter, earns the starting right guard position for a power offense. Think about the Baltimore Ravens and Lamar Jackson and what they like to do. Very different than what he did at Duke. Earns that starting right guard position as a rookie, plays 12 games, and then moves over and plays center for the Baltimore Ravens, the last couple of seasons. And then he winds up at Miami. And Miami is kind of the exact opposite of what the Baltimore Ravens, almost like what he was doing back at Duke. So to me, it wasn't a surprise that he wasn't able to come in and immediately take over that spot. And so he basically got kind of pushed down to the bottom and obviously got released by the Miami Dolphins. But this is another player that if his durability is okay, then I absolutely think that he is a starting caliber center. I have been intrigued by the development I've seen from Kyle Fuller over training camp. But Corbin, we talked about this all offseason. Center and cornerback were the two positions of concern for the Seahawks.
They still are.
Exactly. I'm not satisfied with either one of those positions. So, yeah, I think any attempts to upgrade those two positions should be welcomed by Seahawk fans. And may the best man win, whether it be on the Seattle's roster right now or somebody's floating around in free agency.
Betting on the NFL doesn't have to be a guessing game if you listen to the new Locked On Bets podcast hosted by your boy Q and handicapping expert Lee Sterling. Get daily picks, blowout specials, wrong team favored picks, and of course, Lee Sterling's Lock of the Day. Follow the Locked On Bets podcast brought to you by betonline.ag wherever you get podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Check out the Locked On Seahawks podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and the all-new Odyssey app. That's AUDACY. When we return for our Wednesday show, I'm going to have a very special guest joining the show to break down X's and O's from a Seahawks perspective. The man, the myth, the legend, Brian Baldinger will be joining the show. And Rob, you and I will be revisiting the roster cuts. Hopefully by tomorrow's show, we'll know all the players that have been released and have a better idea what the 53-man roster is going to look like. And, of course, we'll go back to the waiver wire and look at a few other players that might be intriguing for the Seahawks to pick up and enter the roster going into the 2021 season. Thanks for listening in. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Go Hawks.